The overhead light in the recovery room had that particular hospital hum, the one that never quite stops even when everything else does. I had Ren against my chest, still slick with the smell of birth, when the door opened without a knock. Nathan came in first. Behind him, Paige Sorensen, one hand resting low on a belly that hadn't been visible the last time I'd seen her at his office holiday party. Colonel Ashworth was 3 steps behind them both, a small velvet box still in her hand, her mouth already open to say something about a commendation. Nathan set a folder on the tray table beside my bed. Not on the bed. Beside it, like he didn't want to get too close to what I was holding. "I need you to sign these," he said. Silas started to fuss in the bassinet. I didn't look down at him. I looked at the folder, then at Paige's hand on her stomach, then back at Nathan. "Sign what?" "Temporary guardianship." He didn't blink saying it. "For the twins. Until you're stable." Colonel Ashworth's hand closed slowly around the velvet box. Nobody in that room was looking at the commendation anymore. "Nathan," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I delivered these children 6 hours ago. I know. You know. I have paperwork," he said, like that answered something. "From a doctor. I hadn't seen a doctor about anything except the delivery itself. Not once in the last 6 hours had anyone examined me for whatever this paperwork claimed." Ashworth set the velvet box down on the windowsill. Her voice, when it came, had the particular calm of someone who has spent 30 years learning exactly how loud a room needs a person to be. "Whose paperwork?" she said. Ruby's crayon snapped in half against the paper, and she didn't even look up. "2 babies," she said, pressing the broken end down anyway, dragging a green line across the page. "1 for me, and 1 for Daddy." I was 7 months along by then, sitting sideways at the kitchen table, because sitting straight had stopped being comfortable somewhere around week 28. Nathan was in the next room. I could hear him on the phone, his voice doing the thing it did when a call was about money, low and careful, like volume alone might fix a spreadsheet. He'd started 3 companies in the 12 years we'd been married. 2 had folded quietly. The third, a boutique financial advisory firm with his name stenciled on frosted glass, was somewhere in the process of folding loudly, though he hadn't said that in those words. I'd learned to read it in other ways. The calls that ended when I walked into a room. The credit card statement he'd started leaving face down. The way he'd stopped correcting people at parties who assumed my rank meant I out-earned him, because at some point it had simply become true, and true things he didn't want to hear had started arriving at our house like unpaid bills, quiet and inevitable. I know now, in the way you only know things after they've already cost you something, that Nathan's resentment hadn't started with the money. It started years earlier, at some family dinner or another, when his own father had asked me about my last deployment for 20 straight minutes and never once turned to ask Nathan how the firm was doing. I'd watched something close in his face that night, small and quiet, the kind of thing you don't notice is a wound until it's had years to fester into something else. He never said it outright. He didn't have to. It showed up instead in the careful way he stopped mentioning his own work, in the tightness around his eyes, whenever someone introduced me by rank before they introduced him at all. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me had let that slide for far too long, telling myself it was just pride, just an ordinary marriage's ordinary friction, the kind every couple learns to carry. I hadn't understood yet that pride left unattended long enough doesn't stay pride. It curdles into something that goes looking for someone to blame. I'd met him at Walter Reed, technically, though not as a patient, a conference on trauma reconstruction, 3 days of lectures, and he'd been the only person in the audience without a badge, some kind of guest of a guest. He'd asked a smart question about triage economics that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with resource allocation, and I remember thinking, this man understands systems. I hadn't yet learned that understanding a system and respecting one were different things entirely. My father had been a surgeon too, Army, 31 years, the kind of career that leaves a person with more scars on their hands than their record shows. He gave me his old scalpel the day I graduated from medical school, the handle worn smooth where his own hand had held it for 3 decades. Lieutenant Colonel Elias Colt. His name was still etched near the base of it, half worn away. He used to say a good surgeon doesn't rush the parts that matter and doesn't linger on the parts that don't. I'd carried that with me through residency, through 2 deployments, through nights that blurred into other nights. I never told Nathan that line. I'm not sure why. Maybe because some things feel like they'll wear thin if you say them to someone who might not understand what they cost. Maybe because somewhere in the last few years I'd started keeping small, true things to myself, the way you keep a spare key hidden, not because you expect to need it, but because it feels unwise to hand over every way into the house. Ruby held up her drawing. 2 lopsided circles, a scribble of yellow hair, 4 smaller shapes crowded around them that I assumed were meant to be the rest of us. "Which one's the boy?" I asked her. She considered this with the seriousness only a 4-year-old can bring to a crayon drawing. "They're both boys today," she said. "Tomorrow they might be girls." I laughed, and for a moment the sound of Nathan's voice in the other room didn't matter at all. That habit started around then, the note writing. Ruby couldn't read yet. Not really, just a handful of sight words from her preschool flashcards. I left them anyway, on her lunch bag, tucked into the pocket of her backpack. "You are the bravest 4-year-old I know." I don't know when it became less about Ruby and more about needing to put something true into the world, where Nathan's silence had started to take up so much room. He used to read to her every night. I couldn't say exactly when that stopped, only that one evening I noticed the light under her door was off too early, and when I asked, she said Daddy was busy. 2 weeks before the twins came, I found him in his study at 11 at night, laptop open, 3 browser tabs he closed too fast when I walked in. I didn't ask. Some quiet trained into me over years of triage told me that some questions are better asked when you already have an answer waiting. I told myself it was the business. I told myself several things that winter that I'd later have to unlearn one at a time. Colonel Vivian Ashworth caught me in the hallway outside labor and delivery a few days before that, on one of the last shifts I worked before maternity leave. She was chief of surgery at Ashcroft Army Medical Center, had been for 6 years, the kind of officer who remembered everyone's residency thesis topic and asked about it years later like it still mattered to her. "You look tired, Colt," she said, not unkindly. "I'm having twins in 2 weeks, ma'am. That'll do it." She studied me a beat longer than the comment required. "Everything all right at home?" I told her it was fine. I believed it, mostly, the way you believe a structure is sound because you haven't yet seen the crack running through the foundation. She didn't push. She just said she'd be in town the week I delivered, some award ceremony for the surgical staff, and that she'd try to stop by. I thought that was kindness. I didn't understand yet that it would also make her a witness. The morning I went into labor, Nathan drove me to Ashcroft without saying much. Ruby stayed with my sister. I remember thinking, somewhere between contractions, that this was supposed to be the good part, the part where all the strain of the last year finally gave way to something worth the strain. I didn't know yet that Nathan had already been to see a lawyer. I didn't know about the folder that would be sitting on a tray table beside my bed within hours of the twins being born, or the doctor's name that would be signed at the bottom of a document I'd never agreed to. I only knew that Ruby's drawing was still on the refrigerator when I left for the hospital, 2 lopsided circles held up by a magnet shaped like a fire truck, and that some part of me had looked at it on the way out the door and thought, whatever happens next, we'll figure it out as a family. I had no idea how much weight that sentence was about to be asked to carry. A notification blinked at the corner of my hospital tablet, the kind the EHR system sent automatically, and nobody ever read. Chart access anomaly flagged for review. I almost swiped it away. I was 3 days postpartum, still in the recovery wing. Ren asleep against my shoulder, while Silas fussed in the bassinet. Priya kept rocking with one foot, without looking up from her own charting. My hands had gone soft and strange in a way they never did in the OR, clumsy with something other than a scalpel. "You're supposed to be resting," Priya said, not looking up. "I am resting." I tapped the notification anyway. The access log opened slower than it should have. Ashcroft's system was ancient, the kind of software the Army kept limping along because replacing it cost more than anyone wanted to justify in a budget hearing. I scrolled past routine entries, nurses' vitals checks, my own OB team's notes from delivery. Then a name I didn't recognize on a login 3 days before I gave birth. Bregman, H. Locum physician. Access. Full record. I sat very still. Ren's breathing against my collarbone was the only thing that felt steady. "Priya." My voice came out flatter than I meant it to. "Do you know a Dr. Bregman?" She glanced up this time. "Locum guy. Filled in for Ose a few weeks back." "Why?" I didn't answer right away. I read the timestamp again, then the one after it. A second login the morning of the delivery itself. This one lasting 11 minutes, longer than any routine chart pull should take. He accessed my full record before I was ever his patient, I said. Priya set down her tablet. That's not supposed to happen without a consult order. There was no consult order. She was quiet for a second, and in that silence, I did the thing I do when a patient's numbers don't add up, the thing my father taught me before I could legally hold a scalpel. You don't chase the symptom, you chase the pattern underneath it. He billed something last month, Priya said slowly, like she was pulling the memory up from somewhere she hadn't meant to store it. Some consulting fee came up when finance flagged his contract for renewal. I only remember because it was weird, an outside vendor code. Colt something. I figured it was unrelated. Half the vendor codes here start with somebody's last name. Colt Capital Advisors was the name on Nathan's business cards. I didn't say that out loud. I sat there with my daughter's weight against my chest and let the two facts sit next to each other without touching. The way you leave a wound alone for a moment before you decide how deep it goes. Priya was still talking, something about renewal paperwork, but I'd stopped hearing the individual words. I was thinking about the folder on the tray table, the doctor's signature I'd never met. The 11 minutes. Meredith. Priya's hand landed on my arm. You've gone somewhere. Can you pull the full audit trail? I said. Everything Bregman touched. Timestamps, IP, all of it. That's going to take an official request. Then I'll file one. That evening, Nathan called. Not about the twins, not about Ruby. He asked how I was feeling, his voice doing the careful thing it had done in the study weeks earlier, soft in a way that used to mean tenderness, and now meant something closer to management. You should focus on recovering, he said. None of this needs to get complicated. None of what, Nathan? A pause, brief enough that a stranger wouldn't have caught it. The paperwork, the doctor. It's just a formality until things settle. Settle. You know what I mean. I didn't. Not exactly. Not yet. But something in the softness of his voice landed wrong. The way a diagnosis sometimes lands wrong before you can name why. Some instinct trained by years of reading rooms faster than charts. He wasn't asking me to rest. He was asking me to stop looking. The audit trail came back 2 days later, forwarded quietly by a records clerk who owed Priya a favor. I opened it alone. After visiting hours, Ren and Silas both finally asleep, Ruby home with my sister, the recovery room quiet except for the hum of the overhead light that never fully turned off. I found the entry I already suspected I'd find. 11 minutes, the morning of delivery, one field modified. A single line added to my chart, buried between routine notes, the kind of thing no one reads unless they're looking for it. Patient exhibits signs of acute emotional dysregulation. Recommend evaluation of caregiving capacity. Dated 3 days before I ever went into labor. I read it 4 times before the meaning of the date fully landed. Before I understood, I wasn't looking at a note written in a moment of concern. I was looking at a note written in advance of a decision that hadn't happened yet, planted like a flag on ground someone intended to claim later. They hadn't waited to see how I'd handle 3 days postpartum with a newborn on each arm. They'd already decided how the story would end before I delivered a single one of them. The custody filing itself arrived by courier the next morning, while Priya signed for it in my place. Case number 24-FC11287, Ashcroft County Family Court. Nathan's attorney's name printed at the bottom in a font that looked, absurdly, almost cheerful. I stared at the case number longer than the document itself, the way you stare at a diagnosis code before you let yourself read what it actually means. Somewhere in this county, a clerk had assigned my daughter's custody a number, filed it between someone's property dispute and someone else's speeding ticket, as though the shape of my family could be reduced to an entry in a docket. I thought about the note I used to leave in Ruby's lunch bag. You are the bravest 4-year-old I know. I wondered, sitting there with the filing in my lap, whether I was about to need that kind of bravery myself, and whether I actually had it, or had only ever been borrowing it from the uniform. Attorney Desmond Locke had a corner office that smelled faintly of the coffee he never seemed to finish. Framed diplomas hung slightly crooked, like precision mattered to him everywhere except the walls. He read the audit trail twice before he said anything. 11 minutes, he said finally, tapping the printout. That's not a chart review, that's someone building a document. He set the case filing beside it. Case number 24-FC-11287. Filed the same week as that login. Can we prove that in court? We can prove the timestamp. He set the page down. The rest, we're going to need more than a login record. I'd brought Ren with me, asleep in the carrier against my chest, because Priya had a shift, and my sister had Ruby and Silas both, and there was a particular exhaustion in trying to hold a legal strategy meeting, while also making sure a newborn's breathing stayed even. Locke didn't seem to mind. He'd asked once, at the start, if I wanted water, and hadn't mentioned the baby again, which I appreciated more than I could say. "Tell me about the vendor code," he said. I explained what Priya had found, the consulting fee, Colt Capital Advisors billing something through the hospital's finance system a month before I delivered. Locke wrote it down without looking up. "Your husband's company," he said. Not a question. "Yes, doing consulting work. For a hospital. That your husband's wife works at." He finally looked up. "Dr. Colt, I've handled a lot of custody filings. Most of them are messy because two people stopped loving each other and started fighting about furniture instead. This isn't that. What is it then?" "I think your husband's company is in trouble," he said. "I think somebody offered him a way to solve two problems with one signature. Access to hospital contracts through a compliant physician and leverage over you through a custody claim that makes you look unstable right when you're least able to fight it." I sat with that for a moment. It was the kind of diagnosis that made a terrible kind of sense, the way a rare condition sometimes explains symptoms that shouldn't logically connect. "He's not a cruel man," I said, and heard how strange it sounded the moment it left my mouth, defending him in the same conversation where I was building a case against him. He used to be someone who noticed things, small things, whether I'd eaten, whether Ruby's shoes still fit. Locke didn't argue with that. He just said people don't usually start out cruel, Dr. Colt. They start out scared, and then scared people do things that look exactly like cruelty from the outside. I thought about the study, the closed laptop, the calls that ended when I walked in, the years of watching his father ask me about deployments, and never once ask Nathan about the firm. Not evil, maybe. Just a man watching something he'd built come apart, looking for anything solid enough to hold on to, and deciding my career, my body, my recovery, were solid enough to use. That night, at Priya's place, the twins slept in a portable crib in the corner of her guest room, while Ruby colored at the kitchen table, humming something with no discernible tune. Priya made tea neither of us drank and sat across from me like she had all the time in the world. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you diagnose everyone's motives so carefully, you forget to be angry about what they did." I almost laughed. She wasn't wrong. It was easier, somehow, to understand Nathan than to feel the full weight of what he'd done, the way it's easier to read a lab result than to sit with what the numbers mean for the person attached to them. Ruby looked up from her drawing. "Is Daddy still mad?" "I don't think Daddy's mad, baby." I wasn't sure that was true. "I think Daddy's scared." She considered this the way she considered most things, with a seriousness that made her seem older than 4. "Scared people should say sorry," she said, like it was the simplest rule in the world, and went back to her drawing. 2 days later, Nathan asked to meet. Not through Locke. Directly, a text that just said, "Can we talk? Just us." I met him at a diner near the base, neutral ground, Priya watching the twins so I could go alone. He looked thinner than he had 3 weeks earlier, the kind of thin that comes from not sleeping rather than not eating. "I want to withdraw the petition," he said, before I'd even sat down. I didn't answer right away. I studied his face for the calculation I'd learned to recognize over the last 2 weeks, and for once, I didn't find it. He looked, if anything, like a man who'd woken up somewhere he didn't recognize and wasn't sure how he'd gotten there. "Why now?" "Because I saw Silas's newborn photos on your sister's phone, and I wasn't in a single one of them." His voice cracked slightly, and I realized I don't even know what I was trying to win. For a moment, sitting across the cracked vinyl booth, I let myself believe it might actually be that simple. That a man could see a photograph and remember, all at once, what mattered. "I'll call Locke in the morning," he said. "Tell him to drop it." I went home that night lighter than I had in weeks. The specific lightness of a diagnosis you're relieved turns out to be benign. Locke called before 8 the next morning, and his voice had none of the ease Nathan's had the night before. "The hearing got moved up," he said. "Emergency motion, filed late last night. Paige Sorensen's attorney is asking to testify." "Testify about what?" "About you," he said. "Apparently, she's prepared to tell the court you threatened her." I hadn't spoken to Paige Sorensen in my life. I sat down slowly on the bed, phone still pressed to my ear, thinking about the crack in Nathan's voice at that diner, How true it had sounded at the time. "He didn't call you last night," I said. "No," Locke confirmed. "The motion was filed at 11:40. Whatever conversation you had with him yesterday afternoon, it wasn't the start of him changing his mind." I hung up and sat with the silence of Priya's guest room a long moment, Ren stirring faintly against the carrier still hanging on the back of a chair. I thought about the invoice Nathan claimed had changed his mind, the itemized proof of a plan he'd suddenly found shameful in daylight, and wondered whether shame had ever actually touched him, or whether he'd simply needed one more day to buy before Paige's attorney was ready to move. Either way, I understood something clearly for the first time since the folder had landed on my hospital tray table. Whatever apology Nathan had handed me in that diner booth, it had never been the whole story. It had only ever been the version someone wanted me to carry home feeling lighter, right before it would cost the most to have believed it. The county seal above Judge Miriam Castellano's bench had gone slightly tarnished at one corner, the kind of detail you only notice after staring at it for over an hour, waiting for a case number to be called that would decide where your children slept. Case number 24-FC11287, Ashcroft County Family Court. I sat beside Locke at the petitioner's table, hands folded tight enough that my knuckles had gone pale under the fluorescent light. Nathan sat across the aisle, alone. Paige wasn't beside him. That detail landed strangely, though I didn't understand why until later. I'd worn a plain navy dress instead of my uniform, on Locke's advice. "You're not here as an officer," he'd said. "You're here as a mother." I'd sat with that sentence the whole drive over, turning it in my hands like something I wasn't sure I was allowed to keep. "Please state your name and role for the record," Locke said. "Dr. Holt Bregman. Locum physician, contracted through Ashcroft Army Medical Center." Locke rose, unhurried, a single folder in his hand. "Dr. Bregman, I'd like to direct your attention to the entry dated the 14th, 3 days prior to Dr. Colt's delivery. You wrote that she exhibited, quote, signs of acute emotional dysregulation. Did you examine her that day?" A pause, long enough to mean something. "No." "Did you examine her at any point before writing that entry?" "No." "Have you ever examined Dr. Colt at all?" Another pause. Bregman's eyes moved briefly toward the gallery, toward a spot near the back where no one I recognized was sitting. "No." The word landed flat in the room, the way true things sometimes do, without any of the weight you'd expect them to carry. Locke let the silence hold a beat longer than comfortable before his next question. "Then, can you explain how you came to write a clinical assessment of a patient you had never met?" Bregman's jaw worked once before he answered. "I was asked to." "By whom?" Across the aisle, Nathan's attorney rose halfway. "Objection. Relevance." "I'll allow it," Castellano said, without looking up from her notes. "Answer the question, doctor." Bregman's eyes found the back of the gallery again, then dropped to his hands. "Colt Capital Advisors reached out about a consulting arrangement, reviewing hospital vendor contracts. Mr. Colt mentioned, in passing, that his wife's stability might become relevant in a family matter. He suggested it would be helpful if there were documentation." "Helpful to whom?" "To him." The room had gone very quiet. I didn't look at Nathan. I found I couldn't. "One more question, doctor," Locke said. "Were you compensated specifically for this entry, separate from the general consulting arrangement?" Bregman hesitated long enough that the judge glanced up from her notes. "There was an additional payment, $2,000, routed through the same account." Locke let that sit in the room a moment before moving on. He entered the audit trail into evidence next, walked the court through the timestamp, the 11 minutes, the date that preceded my delivery by 3 days. He called Priya, who confirmed the vendor code, the consulting fee, the sequence of a login that had no clinical justification attached to it. Each piece landed quietly, the way real evidence does, without theater, simply accumulating weight. Then Locke called the forensic accountant Priya's records clerk friend had helped track down, a woman named Ferris who spoke in the careful, unhurried cadence of someone used to numbers not lying even when people do. She confirmed Colt Capital Advisors had been 3 payments behind on operating debt for 4 months. She confirmed the consulting arrangement with Ashcroft's finance office had been backdated to appear as though it predated the custody filing, when in fact the contract had been signed the same week as the guardianship paperwork Nathan brought to my hospital room. "Same week," Locke repeated, for the court's benefit. "Not months apart. The same week," Ferris continued, laying out a second thread the audit had turned up, almost by accident. A wire transfer from the consulting fee, split 3 ways within 48 hours of clearing, one portion to an outstanding loan on the firm's office lease, one portion to a retainer for a different attorney, filed under a name that wasn't Nathan's own, a precaution, Ferris suggested, in case this particular filing ever needed to be distanced from him publicly. The third portion, smaller, routed to an account jointly held with Paige Sorensen. Nathan's attorney had almost nothing left to work with by the time Paige's counsel rose to call her as a witness. I watched Paige walk to the stand, watched the way she avoided looking at Nathan entirely, the way her hand rested, out of habit now more than anything, low on a belly that had grown considerably in 3 weeks. "Miss Sorensen," her own attorney began, gently, "can you describe your interaction with Dr. Colt?" Paige's eyes moved to me for the first time since she'd entered the room. "I don't have one," she said quietly. "I've never spoken to her." A ripple moved through the gallery. Nathan's attorney's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, a small collapse, like a structure finding out too late that its foundation had already given. "I was told," Paige continued, "that she'd threatened legal action against me. That's why I agreed to testify. I thought I was protecting myself." Her voice thinned. "I didn't know the paperwork was fake until this week. Nobody told me the doctor's note wasn't real. I didn't know about a joint account either, not until Ferris's report was read into the record just now." She looked down at her hands, at the ring she was still wearing, and for a moment I felt something that surprised me, not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of another woman who'd built a version of her life on ground that had never been as solid as she'd been told. I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite grief, some third thing that didn't have a clean name. Judge Castellano called a brief recess before closing arguments. I stepped into the hallway, needing air that didn't carry the weight of a courtroom, and found Ruby with the family liaison officer at a small table set up for children, crayons scattered across a coloring page of a courthouse that looked nothing like the real one. I crouched beside her. "How you doing, baby?" She looked up, serious in the way she got, when she'd been listening more closely than anyone realized. "Is Daddy going to get in trouble?" "I don't know yet. He said sorry to me on the phone," she said. But he didn't say it like he meant it. He said it like he was reading it. I didn't have an answer for that. I sat with her a few minutes, watching her color carefully inside the lines of a building that bore no real resemblance to the one holding us, and thought about how children always seem to know the shape of a thing before the adults around them are willing to say it out loud. When court resumed, Locke called one final witness before closing, a name that hadn't appeared on any exhibit list. Nathan's own former business partner, a man named Aldous Reyes, subpoenaed the previous afternoon after Ferris found his name buried in an old email chain. "Mr. Reyes," Locke said, "did Nathan Colt ever discuss his marriage with you, in the context of the firm's finances?" Reyes shifted in his seat. "Once. About 2 months ago," he said, and I'm quoting him directly because it stuck with me. He said, quote, "Meredith's the one with the steady paycheck. If this goes bad, I need it to go bad in a way that still leaves me something." The courtroom went still in a way it hadn't for any of the financial testimony. I felt the words land somewhere under my ribs, colder than anything the audit trail had shown me. I thought about every dinner where he'd let his father praise my deployments over his own quiet failures. Every night he'd stayed late in that study, and understood, all at once, that somewhere in that silence, he'd already been doing the math on what I was worth to him if the marriage didn't survive. He said that 2 months before the filing, Locke confirmed, before the twins were even born, Nathan didn't move. He sat very still, staring at a spot on the table in front of him, and for just a moment, he looked less like the man who'd stood over my hospital bed 3 weeks earlier, and more like someone finally hearing, out loud, in a room full of strangers, exactly how far in advance he had planned to survive me. Judge Castellano didn't take long after that. "The court finds no credible evidence supporting the guardianship petition," she said. "The medical documentation submitted was fraudulent, obtained without examination or consent, and coordinated with a financial arrangement that predates and directly conflicts with its stated purpose." She looked at Nathan for the first time in several minutes. "This court takes a dim view of using a mother's recovery from childbirth as leverage in a business transaction, Mr. Colt. The petition is denied in full, and this court is referring the matter of the fraudulent medical documentation to the appropriate licensing authorities." I sat very still after she said it, waiting to feel the relief I'd expected for 3 weeks, and instead felt something quieter arrive in its place, Something closer to the specific stillness that comes after a long surgery, when the room finally goes silent and you realize your hands haven't stopped shaking the entire time. You just hadn't noticed until now that they were allowed to. The courthouse steps still held the morning's cold, when I found Nathan sitting alone near the bottom, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up when my shadow crossed him. Didn't stand. "I keep trying to figure out when it stopped being about protecting the company," he said, "and started being about winning. Does it matter which one it was? I used to think it did." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Bregman's losing his license. The finance office is auditing every contract Colt Capital ever touched. I might lose the firm entirely now, which is almost funny, considering that's the thing I thought I was saving." I thought about Aldous Reyes's testimony, the exact words Nathan had used 2 months before any of this began. If this goes bad, I need it to go bad in a way that still leaves me something. I didn't repeat it back to him. Some things don't need repeating to keep their weight. "Ruby told me you apologized to her on the phone," I said. "She said it didn't sound like you meant it." Something in his face cracked slightly at that, more than anything the judge's ruling had produced. "She's 4. She shouldn't be able to hear the difference." "She's always been able to hear the difference, Nathan. You just weren't listening closely enough to notice." He didn't argue with that. "I'm not offering forgiveness today," I said. "I don't know when I will. What I'm offering is structure. Supervised visits with Ruby until the court says otherwise. Full transparency on anything involving the twins. And you complete an actual program, not a formality, before we discuss anything past that. Okay. And you don't get to decide when you're ready to be trusted again. That's not yours to decide anymore." He nodded slowly, some old resistance flickering in his jaw before it settled. "Okay." I walked away from him without looking back, which felt like its own kind of answer. That evening, Locke called with something I hadn't expected. "I need you to make a decision," he said. "Not a legal one, a personal one." "What kind of decision?" "During discovery, Ferris found something outside the scope of the custody case. Colt Capital's been misrepresenting client funds to cover the debt. Nothing related to you or the children, but it's the kind of thing regulators would want to know about, and right now, you're one of very few people who knows it exists." I sat with that for longer than I expected to need. It wasn't mine to report, not really. It had nothing to do with Ruby, or the twins, or the guardianship petition that had already been decided. Reporting it wouldn't protect my children. It would only ensure that whatever was left of Nathan's company, whatever chance he had at rebuilding something honest, ended instead in an investigation that could follow him for years. I thought about the study door, the calls that stopped when I walked in. The fear I now understood had been sitting underneath all of it, long before the folder ever landed on my hospital tray table. I thought about the 11 minutes, the date that came 3 days before I delivered. I thought, too, about the $2,000 Bregman had been paid specifically to write 4 sentences that could have cost me my daughters. "Send it to the regulators," I said. "All of it." Locke was quiet for a moment. "You understand that's not going to help your case. The case is already over." "I understand." I didn't examine the decision too closely that night, though I knew, even as I made it, that it sat somewhere in the gray space between justice and something less generous. It wasn't about the children. It wasn't about the custody ruling. It was about a version of accountability that went beyond what the court had asked for, and I let myself want that anyway, even knowing some part of it was less about protecting the next family and more about making sure Nathan lost everything he'd been willing to trade me for. Karen, my sister, called 2 days later, the first person from my own side of the family I let myself lean on, since the folder had landed on my hospital tray table. "You did the right thing," she said, after I told her about the report, "even if it doesn't feel like it did." "It doesn't feel like anything yet," I admitted. "Mostly it just feels like the end of accounting for something, like closing a ledger I didn't know I'd been keeping. Maybe that's what the right thing feels like sometimes. Not triumphant, just finished." 6 weeks later, Paige reached out, an unexpected number on my phone one evening, while the twins slept, and Ruby colored at the kitchen table. "I wanted you to know I ended things with him," she said, before I could say anything, before I even knew about the regulatory thing. I just couldn't stay with someone who'd use a hospital bed like that. I didn't know what to say to her. We weren't friends, would likely never be, but there was something in her voice that sounded like a woman trying to climb back to solid ground after finding out the ground she'd been standing on was never real to begin with. "I'm sorry you got pulled into it," I said, and meant it. "I'm sorry I almost testified against you," she said. "I should have asked more questions." We didn't talk long after that. There wasn't much left to say that either of us could carry. Nathan's supervised visits started the following week. He showed up on time every time, quiet in a way he hadn't been in years, like a man relearning how to occupy a room without trying to control it. Ruby warmed to him slowly, the way children do when trust has to be rebuilt one ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a time, rather than won back in a single grand gesture. Priya came by most evenings that first month, ostensibly to help with the twins, but really, I think, to make sure I wasn't sitting alone with all of it. She never asked me to talk about the regulators or the licensing board. She just showed up with takeout and let the silence between us be the kind that didn't need filling. One evening, after Nathan had gone, Ruby climbed onto the couch beside me holding her latest drawing. 2 lopsided circles, smaller now, more careful. A family of 5 crowded loosely around them. "Is this us now?" she asked. I looked at the 5 shapes, at the careful distance she'd drawn between 2 of them, a gap that hadn't been there in the drawing from before the twins were born. "I think it's still figuring itself out, baby," I said. "But yeah, that's us." The fence line at Ashcroft ran along the edge of the parade field, close enough that you could hear the flag snap in the wind during retreat. I stood there with all 3 kids on a Sunday evening months later, Wren asleep in the carrier, Silas gumming a teething ring in my arms, Ruby balanced on the low rail beside me, watching the formation below with the particular focus she brought to things that mattered to her. "Grandpa used to stand like that?" she asked, nodding toward the line of soldiers. "Something like that." I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the scalpel my father had given me, turned it over once in my palm, before letting Ruby hold the handle, careful, her small fingers tracing the worn place where his grip had been for 30 years. "He used to say you don't rush the part that matters, and you don't linger on the part that doesn't." Ruby considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things now, foregoing on some older version of herself the last year had built without asking permission. "Did you rush anything?" "I think I lingered too long on believing something wasn't true," I said. "That's its own kind of rushing, I guess. Rushing past what's right in front of you." Colt Capital Advisors was under formal investigation by then, the kind of slow-moving inquiry that would take years to resolve, and might end with nothing more than a settlement and a quiet dissolution. Aldous Reyes's testimony had opened 3 additional threads the regulators were still pulling on, threads that reached further back than even Ferris had originally traced. I didn't follow all of it closely. I'd learned, somewhere in the last several months, that some things could be set in motion and then released, rather than carried personally the rest of the way. Nathan's visits had become something closer to ordinary, still supervised, still careful, but steadier than either of us had expected 6 months earlier. He'd started therapy on his own, not the court-mandated kind, though that continued too, but something he'd chosen, and there was a difference in the way he spoke now, less like a man managing a crisis, and more like one actually listening. He'd started, in small ways, asking about the twins, the way a father asks, rather than the way a defendant recites facts he thinks will help his case. I noticed it without commenting on it. Some things needed time to prove themselves before they deserved acknowledgement. I'd made colonel by then, the promotion ceremony small, held in the same building where Ashworth had once tried to hand me a commendation before everything unraveled. She pinned the new insignia herself, her hands steady the way they'd been steady in every operating room I'd ever watched her work. "I'm proud of the surgeon you've become," she said afterward. Then she looked at the 3 kids crowded around my legs, and even prouder of the mother. Silas fussed against my shoulder, and I shifted him without thinking, the motion worn smooth by months of practice, the same way my father's grip had worn smooth into a scalpel handle over 30 years of careful work. Ruby handed the scalpel back to me, and I slid it into my coat pocket, the metal still warm from her hand. "Do you think Daddy's sorry now?" she asked. "For real this time?" "I think he's getting there," I said. "Sorry isn't something you say once and finish. It's something you keep doing, every ordinary day, until the people you hurt believe you." She nodded, like that made sense to her, in the particular way children accept complicated truths without needing every piece explained. We stood there a while longer, until the flag came down and the formation dispersed, and the evening settled into that deep blue that comes right before full dark, the same deep blue I remembered from the night I'd carried a folder full of evidence out of Desmond Locke's office and understood, for the first time, that I wasn't going to lose my daughters to a piece of paper someone had paid $2,000 to falsify. If you were in my position, would sending that regulatory report have felt like justice to you, or would it have crossed a line the court never asked you to cross, especially once you knew part of your reason for sending it was making sure he lost more than the case? Let me know what you think in the comments. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There's another one waiting next week.